There is a woman alive right now who sang to billions from the top of the Eiffel Tower, while her body was waging a war against her from the inside. A disease so rare that only 1 in a million people on Earth will ever hear its name spoken in a doctor's office directed at them. She did not perform that night because the medical team cleared her. She performed because she decided she was not finished. And the world, all of it, stopped and watched and wept and did not fully understand why until the moment was already over. This is not a story about fame. Fame is the surface. Beneath the surface is something far more difficult to look at and far more difficult to look away from. A girl born 14th in a family of 14 in a farmhouse in rural Quebec, where the winters were brutal and the floors were shared, and ambition was something other people's children had. A voice that arrived fully formed and ancient in a child who had no business having it. A sacrifice of language, identity, and childhood made before she was old enough to understand what any of those things fully meant. A love that the world tried to disqualify, and she refused to give up. A grief that carried no public funeral and demanded no public sympathy and broke her privately in ways that the stage lights never revealed. And now, a disease that took direct aim at the only thing she had never once imagined living without. Her voice. 200 million records sold. The most famous song of the 20th century. An Oscar. Multiple Grammys. Stadiums on every continent. And behind all of it, a human being navigating a story that no trophy could summarize and no spotlight could fully reach. Before you knew her name, before the world knew her name, she was singing on a kitchen table in Charlemagne, Quebec, to a room full of people who laughed nervously because they could feel that something was happening that did not belong to the ordinary world. That feeling has never left the room. It is still there. It is in everything that follows. To understand where Celine Dion is now, you have to understand exactly where she started. Not the version of the start that gets cleaned up for award show retrospectives. The real version. The one where the cold is specific and the hunger is real and talent means nothing because no one has yet invented the mechanism to receive it. Charlemagne, Quebec is a town that barely registers on maps. It sits northeast of Montreal, small enough that everyone knows everyone and ambitious enough for nobody. A place where the roads are narrow and the winters arrive early and leave late and the houses are built not for beauty but for endurance. It was in this town on March 30th, 1968 that Celine Marie Claudette Dion entered the world. She was the 14th child. The 14th. In a household already overflowing with voices and mouths and beds shared 2 and 3 to a frame. Her arrival was not a surprise. It was simply the next chapter in a family that had long since stopped counting and kept choosing love anyway. Her father Adhemer played accordion. Her mother Therese sang. Every evening in a house too small and too loud for silence, the family gathered around instruments and filled the walls with something money could never purchase. Sound. Warmth. The particular kind of love that asks nothing except your presence. Celine absorbed it all from the moment she could form words. She sang. Not shyly. Not as a child testing something new. She sang with a certainty that unnerved even the people who loved her most. Her siblings recalled how she would climb onto the kitchen table, that makeshift stage, and perform with a seriousness that made the adults in the room laugh nervously. Not because she was funny, because they could feel it even then. This was not a child playing pretend. This was something else arriving through a child's body. At 5 years old, she performed publicly for the first time at her brother Michel's wedding. The guests fell quiet, not out of politeness, out of something closer to awe. A sound had come out of that small body that did not belong to childhood. It was enormous. It was ancient. And it was achingly, unmistakably real. But here is the thing about extraordinary talent in the wrong zip code. It does not feed a family of 16. The Dion household struggled with the particular dignity of the working poor. Never complaining, never surrendering, but always aware of the distance between what was needed and what was available. Celine wore hand-me-down clothes. She shared a room with sisters. School was secondary to survival. And even as her voice grew more extraordinary with every passing year, the world outside Charlemagne had no machinery in place to receive it. Then came the moment that changed everything, and it established the pattern that would define her entire life from that day forward. At 12 years old, Celine co-wrote a song with her mother Therese and her brother Jacques. A simple song, a heartfelt song called Ce n'était qu'un rêve. It was only a dream. They recorded a demo on a basic cassette, placed it in an envelope, and mailed it to René Angelil, a music manager in Montreal known for transforming Quebec performers into stars. René almost did not open it. He received hundreds of tapes. Most were forgotten before the envelope was fully torn. But something made him play this one. And the moment that voice came through the speakers, 12 years old, unpolished, barely trained, René Angelil wept. He would later say it was the only time in his professional life that a voice had reduced him to tears before the song was even finished. He called immediately. He wanted to meet her. What followed was not simply the discovery of a talent. It was the beginning of an arrangement that would reshape every corner of Celine's existence. René mortgaged his house, his own home, to fund her first album. He became her manager, her architect, her protector, and eventually, in a development that would divide the world into believers and critics, something far more than any of those things. But before the world could form its opinions, there was work to be done. Brutal, relentless, identity-altering work. René's vision was vast, and it required Celine to be remade from the ground up. Her teeth were corrected, her image refined, her French polished, and most critically, her English, which did not exist at the time, had to be constructed from nothing. For a girl who had grown up in a French-speaking household in rural Quebec, learning English was not a language exercise. It was an act of cultural reconstruction. She studied obsessively. She practiced in front of mirrors. She repeated phrases until they stopped feeling foreign and started feeling like armor. She did not resist. She did not complain. Because somewhere in the deepest part of herself, beneath the hand-me-down clothes and the kitchen table performances, Celine Dion had always known one thing with absolute certainty. The voice inside her was not hers alone to keep. It was meant to travel. And she would surrender anything, language, comfort, childhood, identity, to let it reach as far as it needed to go. She had no idea yet what that promise would truly cost her. Fame does not knock. It does not announce itself politely at the door with flowers and a handshake. It breaks through walls. It rearranges every room. It moves furniture you did not know you had and leaves behind a version of your life that looks familiar from a distance but feels entirely unrecognizable up close. For Celine Dion, fame arrived in waves, each one larger than the last, each one demanding more than the one before. The first wave came in 1988. She was 19 years old. Rene had spent 6 years building her career in Quebec with surgical precision. French albums, television appearances, a growing reputation as the most gifted voice in Canadian music. But René's ambition did not stop at the borders of Quebec. It did not stop at the borders of Canada. And so he entered her in the Eurovision Song Contest, representing Switzerland, with a song called Ne partez pas sans moi, Don't Leave Without Me. Eurovision was not simply a competition. It was a declaration watched by hundreds of millions across Europe. And Celine, standing on that stage before an audience that had never heard of her, did what she had always done on every stage since she was 5 years old, standing on a kitchen table in Charlemagne. She silenced the room. She won by a single point, the closest margin in the contest's history. But she won. And overnight, the girl from a farmhouse in rural Quebec had a name that reached across an ocean. But Rene knew that Europe was not the destination. The destination was America. And America in 1988 had no appetite for a French-Canadian singer performing in a language most of its audience had never studied. The challenge was not talent. Talent had never been in question. The challenge was identity. What followed was one of the most deliberate reinventions in music history. She paused her recording career entirely for 18 months. She disappeared from the stage. She studied English with the ferocity of someone preparing for war. She worked with vocal coaches, image consultants, language tutors. She did not simply learn a new language. She rebuilt herself inside it until the words stopped sitting awkwardly on her tongue and started flowing with the ease of someone who had always belonged to both worlds. When she returned, it was with Unison, her first English language album. And the industry noticed immediately. The voice had not changed. If anything, it had deepened, grown more controlled, more devastating. Critics who had been skeptical reached for superlatives they rarely used. And audiences in North America discovered for the first time what Quebec had known for almost a decade. This was not merely a singer. This was a force of nature wearing a human face. The second wave came faster, harder, and higher. The Color of My Love in 1993. Falling Into You in 1996, which won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year and became one of the best-selling albums in history. Let's talk about Love in 1997. By the mid-1990s, Celine Dion was not competing with other artists. She had entered a category that existed almost entirely alone. Her concerts filled stadiums. Her albums broke records in markets as different as Japan, Brazil, South Africa, and Australia. She sang for presidents, for royalty, for billions watching on television screens in living rooms from Manila to Montreal. And then came the wave that carried everything else. 1997, Titanic. James Cameron's film had already become the most expensive production in Hollywood history before a single ticket was sold. What it needed, what Cameron knew it desperately needed, was a song that could hold the full emotional weight of the entire story. A song that could make 2 hours and 40 minutes of tragedy feel personal, intimate, something that would follow the audience out of the cinema and into their lives. He chose Celine. My Heart Will Go On was not simply a hit. It was a cultural event. It played on every radio station on Earth simultaneously. It won the Academy Award for Best Original Song. It won the Grammy. It became the best-selling single of all time by a female artist and one of the best-selling singles in the entire history of recorded music. For months, it was impossible to exist in the modern world without encountering it. Celine Dion was no longer famous. She was historic. But it was precisely at the summit of that history that the story beneath the story began to surface. And it was a story the world was not entirely prepared to receive with grace. René Angelil was 26 years older than Celine. He had discovered her at 12, managed her through adolescence, shaped every professional decision of her life. And somewhere along that journey, in a development that neither could have predicted and neither attempted to hide, they had fallen in love. They announced their relationship publicly in 1993. Celine was 25. René was 51. The reaction was immediate and divided. Supporters pointed to the obvious. Two adults who had chosen each other with full knowledge of their circumstances. Critics pointed to the power imbalance. A manager who had controlled every aspect of a young woman's life since childhood, and the complicated questions that history raises whenever those lines blur. Tabloids dissected the age gap with a particular cruelty reserved for women who make choices the public finds uncomfortable. Celine did not flinch. She had spent her childhood being underestimated. She had spent her adolescence being remade. She had spent years building a voice strong enough to fill stadiums. She was not about to allow anyone else's discomfort to define the most important relationship of her life. He is my life, she said simply, in interview after interview. Not defensively, not apologetically, with the quiet, absolute certainty of someone who had made a decision they would not revisit. They married in December 1994. The ceremony became one of the most watched events in Canadian history. Celine wore a 7-pound tiara and a gown that required 6 people to carry. Rene stood at the altar with the particular stillness of a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone in the room, the precise weight of what he was receiving. For years the marriage appeared to the world as a counterpoint to every industry cliché. A partnership of genuine depth built on shared history, mutual devotion, and an understanding of the music business that most couples could never access. They were, by every observable measure, inseparable. But privately, the road was harder than the photographs suggested. Celine had always wanted children. The desire was not peripheral. It was central, urgent, almost primal. Yet month after month, year after year, pregnancy did not come. She and Rene entered the painful and hope-destroying cycle of in vitro fertilization treatment. Injections, procedures, waiting rooms filled with the particular silence of people trying not to want things too badly, and the specific grief of loss that carries no public funeral and demands no public sympathy. She miscarried multiple times. She spoke about it rarely. When she did, the words were measured, but the weight behind them was not. Every time I had to put myself back together and go on stage, she admitted in a rare moment of candor. Because the show was the show. The audience did not know, and I had to give them everything even when I had nothing left. Hold that image for a moment. Celine Dion standing under stage lights performing My Heart will go on to 50,000 people while privately carrying grief that most of the world would never know she was holding. That is one of the most haunting realities of her entire story. The sheer volume of pain being managed in silence behind the most recognized voice on earth. In 2001, after years of treatments and losses, René Charles was born. The joy was enormous, uncontainable, visibly transformative. Celine stepped back from recording. She stepped back from touring. She chose for the first time in her adult life to let something other than music come first. Then came 2003, and the announcement of the A New Day has come residency at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas. A 5-year contract. Over 700 performances. The most ambitious residency in the history of live music. The show became a phenomenon, and for a time it seemed as though Celine Dion had found the perfect equation. The stage, the family, the balance. But life does not honor equations. In 2013, René Angelil was diagnosed with throat cancer for the second time. The first diagnosis had come in 1999, and Celine had responded then as she would respond now by rearranging the entire architecture of her life around his survival. She had taken a 2-year hiatus from her career, canceled tours, declined offers, disappeared from an industry that runs on constant visibility. She sat beside him through treatment. She held his hand through the worst of it. And when he recovered, she returned to the stage with a voice that, if anything, had grown more devastating for everything it had carried in the silence. But the second diagnosis was different. Rene was older. The cancer was more aggressive. The treatments that followed were brutal in a way that no amount of wealth or preparation could soften. Celine watched the man who had built her world, who had mortgaged his house for her first album, who had shaped every decision of her professional life, who had become her husband and her partner and her anchor, slowly diminish. She performed night after night with the same extraordinary presence the audience had always known. And she went home after each show to a husband who was fighting for his life with the same quiet determination he had always brought to everything. In 2014, she gave birth to twin boys, Nelson and Eddie, conceived through a final round of in vitro fertilization. It was a miracle of timing, so precise it felt almost cruel. New life arriving as another life was retreating. She held her twins and looked across the room at Rene and understood with absolute clarity that joy and grief are not opposites. At their deepest, they are the same feeling, wearing different faces. René Angelil died on January 8, 2016. He was 73 years old. He died at home in Las Vegas, surrounded by family. 2 days later, Celine's brother Daniel died from brain cancer, adding a second grief to the first before the first had even found its footing. 2 losses in 48 hours. The man who had heard her at 12 years old and wept. The brother she had grown up with in Charlemagne. Gone within days of each other. The world mourned alongside her. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Heads of state, fellow artists, millions of ordinary people who had grown up with her voice and felt, in the particular way that great artists create, that they had lost someone they personally knew. But Celine's grief was not the grief of a celebrity losing a colleague. It was the grief of a woman losing the fixed point of her entire adult life. He was my whole world, she said simply. And then, with the particular courage that had defined her since she was a child on a kitchen table in Charlemagne, she went back to work. Not immediately, not without cost, but she went back. The Las Vegas residency resumed. The tours continued. She performed with a new dimension in her voice that her audiences recognized but could not name. It was grief, yes, but it was also something harder and more durable than grief. It was the sound of a woman who had decided that the best way to honor what she had lost was to continue. For 3 years it appeared she had succeeded. Then her body told her otherwise. The first signs were easy to dismiss. A stiffness in her legs. Muscle spasms that came and went without clear cause. Occasional difficulty with movements she had performed 10,000 times without thinking. Celine, who had always maintained a ferocious discipline around her physical condition. The voice was everything, and the voice required a body that functioned. Began working harder with her trainers. Adjusting her routines. Searching for answers in physiology that had not yet revealed its true question. By 2019, the symptoms were impossible to ignore. She canceled several performances. She cited muscle spasms. The explanation was true, but it was also, she would later admit, incomplete. Because what she was experiencing was not a routine injury or the accumulated strain of decades on the road. It was something far more unfamiliar, far more frightening, and far more resistant to every tool that had always carried her through difficulty before. In December 2022, Celine Dion disclosed publicly what she had been privately confronting for years: stiff person syndrome, a rare neurological disorder so rare that it affects approximately 1 in a million people. It causes progressive muscle rigidity, debilitating spasms, a gradual loss of control over the body's most fundamental functions. In severe cases, it affects the ability to walk. In the cruelest cases, and Celine's case was severe, it affects the ability to sing. The voice that had sold 200 million records. The voice that had silenced arenas. The voice that had carried grief and joy and the full spectrum of human feeling to every corner of the earth. That voice was now at risk. Not from age, not from overuse, not from a single traumatic event, but from a disease that no one fully understands and no one has yet found a reliable way to stop. The announcement shook the music world. She had been preparing for the Courage World Tour, one of the most anticipated comebacks in recent memory. One by one, the dates were postponed, then postponed again, then canceled entirely. Fans who had waited years, some who had purchased tickets multiple times through pandemic rescheduling, received refunds and the particular hollow silence of an absence that carries no clear end date. For Celine, the silence was something different. She had been performing since she was 5 years old. The stage was not simply her career. It was her language. The primary way she had always communicated the things that words alone could not hold. To be separated from it, not by choice but by a body that had stopped cooperating, was a loss so profound it defied her usual vocabulary of survival. She admitted in a documentary released in 2024 titled I Am Celine Dion that there were days when the spasms were so severe she could not move. Days when she lay on the floor of her home, alone with the particular helplessness of a woman who had overcome poverty and grief and public scrutiny and the loss of the person she loved most, undone by her own nervous system. She showed the camera what most artists would never show: the treatments, the therapy sessions, the tears, the fury, the moments when the body she had disciplined and trusted for 6 decades refused to perform the most basic requests. She did not hide behind publicists or careful statements. She showed it all. And in showing it all, she did something that her most spectacular performances had perhaps never fully achieved. She became finally and completely visible, not as a legend, not as a monument, not as the voice behind the most famous song of the 20th century, but as a woman, tired, fighting, afraid, and absolutely refusing to surrender. "I am not going to give up," she said, her voice, even diminished by illness, carrying the echo of every stage she had ever stood on. "I have to, for my boys, for myself, for everyone who has ever listened." In 2025, Celine Dion lives in Las Vegas with her 3 sons, René Charles, now in his early 20s, and twins Nelson and Eddie, who are 11. The house that René chose and loved, the house where he died, the house where she stayed, not out of an inability to leave, but out of the particular stubbornness of a woman who refuses to let grief erase the places where love lived. Her mornings begin not with vocal warm-ups, but with medical routines that would exhaust most people before the day had properly started. Physical therapy to manage the muscle rigidity that stiff person syndrome imposes without negotiation. Medications carefully calibrated by a team of specialists who are in many ways navigating as much uncharted territory as she is. Because the disease is so rare that even the world's leading neurologists are still assembling its full picture. She works with her body the way she once worked with her voice. With discipline, with patience, with the understanding that progress is measured not in dramatic leaps, but in the stubborn accumulation of small victories. A walk taken without assistance. A morning with fewer spasms than the one before. A song hummed in the kitchen without the voice giving way. Each one a triumph. Each one invisible to the world that once watched her fill stadiums. René Charles has spoken carefully but clearly about his mother in the years since his father's death and her diagnosis. He has described a woman who is, in his words, the strongest person I know. Not because she does not struggle, but because she struggles without hiding it from her children. She has chosen deliberately and consistently to show her sons what endurance looks like when it is not performed for an audience. The twins were 6 years old when their father died. They have grown up in the particular landscape of a family rebuilt around absence and presence simultaneously. The absence of Rene, whose photograph sits in every room of the house. The presence of Celine, imperfect, fighting, fiercely and demonstrably there. Friends who visit describe a home that feels lived in rather than curated. Children's drawings on the walls alongside photographs of performances that span 4 decades. A piano that René Charles plays. The sound of boys arguing over video games in a room down the hall. The ordinary, irreplaceable texture of family. Which is, when stripped of all the mythology, what Celine Dion has always wanted most. "The boys are everything," she has said. "Everything I do. Every day I get up and fight this. I do it because I want them to see that you do not stop. You do not stop because it is hard. You stop when there is nothing left. And there is still so much left." Her fortune, estimated at over $800 million, is managed with a focus that has shifted entirely away from empire and toward legacy. The Celine Dion Foundation, which she and Rene established years before his death, continues to fund programs for disadvantaged youth, education, arts access, and children's health care. She has spoken publicly about her intention to ensure that the children who begin with nothing, the way she began in a farmhouse in Charlemagne with hand-me-down clothes and a voice that had nowhere to go, have pathways she never had. She has also spoken, with the particular directness of someone who has watched wealth fail to protect against every meaningful loss about what money cannot do. It could not save Rene. It could not prevent the disease. It could not bring back the years of performing that stiff person syndrome has taken. It could not make grief shorter or recovery faster or the mornings easier. What it could do, what she has chosen to make it do, is create possibility for people who have none. In that, she is not simply distributing wealth. She is converting pain into purpose. Her relationship with music remains the most complicated chapter of her present. She has not performed a full concert since the onset of her illness. But she has not been silent. In the summer of 2024, she performed at the Paris Olympics opening ceremony. A moment that stopped the world. Standing on the Eiffel Tower, bathed in golden light, she sang La Vie en Rose, Edith Piaf's Hymn to Love and Loss, to an audience of billions watching around the globe. Her voice was not the instrument that recorded My Heart Will Go On or filled stadiums in Tokyo and London and Buenos Aires. But it was hers. Undeniably. Unmistakably. Heartbreakingly hers. The world watched and understood in a way that no press release or documentary could fully articulate what they were witnessing. Not a comeback. Not a performance in the traditional sense. But a declaration. From a woman standing on one of the most iconic structures on Earth, telling anyone who would listen that she was still here. That she had not gone quiet. That the voice, battered and changed and fighting its own war, was still capable of reaching across an ocean and making a stranger feel for 3 minutes and 40 seconds that they were not alone. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Artists wept watching it. Fans who had grown up with her music described feeling something they could not name. Something between relief and grief, and the particular gratitude you feel when something you feared you had lost turns out to still exist in the world. It was by every measure the most powerful performance of her career. Not because it was technically perfect, but because it was true. And perhaps that is the lesson Celine Dion's life carries most insistently for those willing to receive it. She began in a farmhouse where perfection was never the point. Only presence. Only love. Only the stubborn act of showing up and giving what you had. She rose to heights so rarefied that the air itself seemed different up there. Grammys. Oscars. Stadiums. The most famous song of a generation. She loved a man the world told her she should not love. And she loved him without apology until the morning he was gone. She survived grief that would have silenced most. She faced a disease that tried to take the only thing she had never been able to imagine living without. And through all of it, the farmhouse and the stadiums and the hospital rooms, and the mornings that began with physical therapy instead of vocal warm-ups, she remained with a consistency that is itself a kind of genius, exactly and entirely herself. Not a legend, not a monument, a woman, a mother, a daughter of Charlemagne who gave the world her voice and asked only in return that the world listen. The world listened. And now in the quieter chapters of a life that has never once been quiet, she offers something more valuable than spectacle. She offers the image of a human being, imperfect, scarred, fighting, present, who decided that the story was not over simply because the easy part was finished. That is her final performance, and it requires no stage,